Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. What are the chances for a real ceasefire to end Israel's war and siege against Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. Both sides, Hamas and Israel, have made their offers to end one of the most brutal wars of modern times. Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire, and Israel wants a more temporary truce. Now's the hard part. Negotiations through mediators to find a compromise as the war bleeds into its fifth month. With every day that passes, conditions worsen for the 2.3 million Palestinians who are surrounded, isolated, and desperate in Gaza. Zoom out, and things don't look all that stable from the U.S. vantage point across the region. Armed groups are hitting American targets in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, and the U.S. is now hitting back. Lebanon and Israel have daily cross-border attacks, and the U.S. has bombed targets in Yemen to stop Ansar Allah from trying to impose a naval blockade on trade with Israel. So are we witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in the Middle East, one where the United States has much less control and less ability to pursue its interests? Today, we're talking with political scientist Stephen Walt, professor of international relations at Harvard University and author of The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. Stephen, it's great to have you on. Look, 4 months ago, at the beginning of this conflict, you and I spoke, and you were very prescient about what you would saw would evolve and come in. And I guess my big question to you today is, does the Israel-Gaza conflict, which grinds on, matter in any substantial way to the United States? What are the impacts of this conflict on President Biden, on the perception of American power in the world? Or is it trivial?
Oh, it's certainly not trivial. This has, I think, exposed the double standards in American foreign policy in ways that are damaging to the United States, certainly damaging to the Biden administration. I don't know how many, I've lost count of how many times Secretary of State Blinken has been to the region to try and make some progress. Thus far, he's failed across the board. This has, I think, made the United States look more hypocritical in claiming to stand for a rules-based order, to be a defender of human rights. And when you think about it, it's America's adversaries who benefit most greatly from events like this, because not only does the United States look somewhat ineffectual, but it makes us look inconsistent in the eyes of many.
And yet, when it comes to try to influence Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to not kill innocent people, and a country that is largely dependent on U.S. aid and support, America looks pretty darn impotent, in my view. What do you think?
Yeah, well, there's two problems here. One problem about which I've written extensively in the past, of course, is American domestic politics. The United States has lots of potential leverage over Israel, which it doesn't use because that would generate a backlash from the Israel lobby, and that's a domestic political problem for Biden or any other American president. The other difficulty here, and it doesn't just apply to Israel, is that in conflicts like this, others usually have more stake in the game than we do, precisely because we're so secure already. So all of the various actors in the Middle East whom we're trying to influence are hard to push around because ultimately they've got more skin in the game. They're willing to bear greater costs, and they're going to pursue their own objectives independent of what the United States does, especially if the United States is not using all the leverage at its disposal. But sometimes, even if it tries, others are willing to resist. Just look at the Houthis in Yemen right now, who are not very powerful, but they care more about what's going on in their neighborhood than we do.
Well, one of the things that I know you've been weighing in on are the various chess pieces and moves of the players. And Hamas has come out and issued its terms on what it would accept as part of a ceasefire, a very large release of prisoners in Israel in exchange for all of the hostages and ending all conflict for 45 days. Israel is rejecting that at the moment, and it has its terms for ceasefire. On top of this, you have Secretary of State Antony Blinken continuing to talk to the Saudis. And somehow in that picture are rumors of a Palestinian state of some sort being in there. What are the real elements that you see at play? And is there any chance that you see of this crisis leading to some constructive creation of, some assembly of Palestinian justice and autonomy?
Well, I don't think it's going to happen quickly. The most immediate effect that this whole conflict has had is it has put the Palestinian issue back on the agenda. This had been put to one side by several administrations, certainly by the Trump administration, but also by the Biden administration. The Israelis, of course, were attempting to keep the Palestinian issue off the agenda. And one could even argue that some Arab countries were not paying very close attention to it anymore either. And of course, what Hamas did, unfortunately, through a very brutal attack, was to remind everyone that the fate of 7.5 million Palestinians could not be ignored forever. So it's back on the agenda. The question is whether or not you're actually going to see something tangible. The Saudis issued a statement last week suggesting that they are not going to play unless there's something really concrete that finally comes through. They're not going to normalize relations with Israel until you actually see a genuine, viable Palestinian state. We'll see if they stick to that. The biggest problem we face is, we've tried to get a two-state solution in the past. American presidents have occasionally worked pretty hard at it, although, again, they've rarely used all the leverage at their disposal. But the conditions for it, if anything, are less propitious now, less appealing now. First of all, it's in the wake of a horrific conflict where 1,200 Israelis died and now 27,000 Gazans have died. You've had the steady rightward drift of the Israeli body politic over the last 10 or 20 years, which means that it's much harder to sell any kind of two-state solution in Israel now. You have a government that's committed to a greater Israel. So the issue is on the agenda. I think more and more people realize this problem will never be solved if you don't get a political solution. But getting to that political solution is just as difficult as it ever was, and probably more so.
I want to play a tape for you of Pentagon spokesman Major General Pat Ryder commenting on some of the hot action that's just occurred in Iraq and with Yemen.
It should be very clear that our goal here in both situations is to ensure security and stability in those regions. We're not seeking to escalate, but if our forces are threatened, as I've highlighted, we will respond appropriately.
My question to you is, are we being told, no, we're not escalating, but in fact, we are escalating?
Yeah, there's several things going. Yes, we're escalating, as are others. It's not, I wouldn't want to say that the United States actually started this process. What's interesting about this is that at the very beginning of the war in Gaza, there was, I think, a pretty conscious effort by many of the interested parties to try and keep the lid on, signaling in various ways that they didn't want to see it expand. Iran made this clear. Hezbollah made this clear. To some degree, the Israelis did not want to expand it beyond Gaza as well. So, and the United States certainly was hoping to confine the problem to Gaza. But the longer a conflict like this goes on and the more suffering is witnessed every day, the harder it is to keep the lid on, the harder it is for outsiders to remain uninvolved without appearing to be complicit, either tacitly or actively. And that has gradually led other actors to start doing more. The most obvious case was, of course, the Houthis beginning to attack shipping in the Gulf of Suez and Red Sea. But now you've also seen this beginning to happen with militias in Iraq and Syria, the attack on an American base in Jordan as well. So you're seeing the effort to keep the lid on begin to erode. The irony in all of this, of course, is the American statement, along with some others, that our goal is always to restore deterrence, that we have to retaliate to these attacks in order to reestablish a situation of stability. And that's a perfectly acceptable goal. But if you're restoring deterrence for the 10th or 15th or 50th or 100th time, maybe you should ask yourself whether or not the actions you're taking to restore deterrence are actually making the problem worse. And I think that may be the dynamic we're now finding ourselves in.
I think one of the fascinating things that's happening in the world, I often try to sort of put myself in the shoes of the Houthis or the Yemenis or the other players in this and look at how they're looking at the order. We used to call it the rules-based order, but let's call it the anarchic order. And to look at that situation and say, why does the United States get to make rules about shipping lanes? Why aren't we able to take actions on behalf of people we think are under siege? Do you think America's place in the world is being shoved back by some of these small players?
I think to some degree, yes. As I said at the outset, part of it is the exposing elements of hypocrisy. And we all know that countries are sometimes hypocritical, but this has been an especially vivid case as well. With respect to the Houthis, what they're doing actually, to me, highlights the importance of getting a ceasefire as rapidly as possible. They have repeatedly said that their attacks will cease once the war stops. Now, that may be a bluff, that may be lying, they may be lying, but let's test them on that. If you are upset about the attacks they're undertaking, and we should be, and you don't want to have to get into a situation where you're constantly bombing Yemen in an attempt to stop them, then maybe the thing to do is get a ceasefire and see if they cease their attacks. If so, that would be a success for diplomacy. It would also be good for all of the other parties involved, with the possible exception of Prime Minister Netanyahu himself.
Well, if you put yourself in the shoes of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and look at his terrain, which I also try and do, it's overwhelmingly in support of the conflict continuing. And I guess that, to me, looks pretty dire for those that want to look. It looks dire from a position on Red Sea shipping. It looks dire when it comes to the state of Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, do you see any way in which the alignment that Prime Minister Netanyahu has right now would be shifted by circumstances?
I'd want to unpack that particular question and separate out the issue of a ceasefire to end the conflict in Gaza from the question of establishing a Palestinian state. Those are two separate things. And the establishing a Palestinian state is the long-term or medium-term goal. The short-term goal that I think is in most of the parties' interests is to actually end the fighting itself, in part because there isn't a military solution here. It's increasingly clear the Israeli Defense Forces are not going to destroy Hamas, which is the stated war aim there. So a ceasefire would, first of all, be very much in the interest of the Palestinian civilians who are suffering and dying. It would very much be in the American interest, where we would be seen as a peacemaker rather than encouraging a conflict. The war itself is costly for Israel because they have to keep mobilizing troops. People are displaced as well. They are losing soldiers too. I think it would be in the interest of the rest of the region, and certainly because it would remove the gasoline that is fueling then the expansion, the escalation that we talked about before. The one person who many Israelis recognize does not have much of an interest in ending the war quickly is Prime Minister Netanyahu, because as soon as you get a ceasefire, there's going to be accountability for how he mishandled things that led to the original October 7th attacks. And many people believe that the end of the war will also be the end of his political career. So in a sense, he has an incentive to try and keep it going. It keeps the unity cabinet intact, and it avoids the day of reckoning he is likely to face within Israeli domestic politics.
Now, Steve, I see you as an ultra-realist, so this next question may be unfair, but it has to do with another lid that may be coming off for Israel, and that's what's brewing in the International Court of Justice and the requirement that Israel respond to the International Court of Justice findings that there may be plausible genocide underway. Israel is required to respond to that finding. And I'm just interested both where you think Israel will go with that, but also, again, in the court of global opinion in this, about the finding possibly of genocide. Do you think that has any force in chastening the direction of Israel?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. And even as a realist, I think words and labels do matter. It's important to note the International Court of Justice did not find that Israel had been committing a genocide. It found that there was a plausible grounds for concern, issued orders that Israel should take steps to avoid this, and authorized a lengthier investigation as to what has happened, which was probably going to take months, if not years. This has already had some immediate effects. A Japanese trading firm announced a couple of days ago that it was severing ties with an Israeli arms company over this issue in light of the ICJ ruling. So it's already having some short-term consequences. But over the longer term, it's affecting Israel's image in a fundamental way. That word now gets associated with Israel in ways that are obviously deeply troubling for everyone. It's the same reason that Israel was very concerned when people started describing the situation on the West Bank as one of apartheid. By the way, that's not just groups like Amnesty International, that's also Israeli human rights groups as well, because that's a label that carries with it a whole series of images. Not surprisingly, Israel has fought the use of the term apartheid. They are now actively contesting the use of the term genocide because they understand that words do matter here and are going to shape opinions. To the extent that that label gets assigned, it does make it harder for other countries to cooperate. It creates problems for politicians who want to work with Israel for one reason or another. It certainly makes it more difficult for Arab countries to move closer to Israel, despite some common interests as well. And I think it's not surprising, therefore, that this has become such a hot and contested political issue. Even if that label doesn't ultimately get applied, I think it's abundantly clear that what Israel has done has been conducting sort of massive war crimes in Gaza, just as Hamas also conducted war crimes in attacking Israeli civilians on October 7th. And that's going to be a permanent stain on Israel's national image, too.
Let me ask you something about the U.S. dynamic in Israel right now. We've seen in the West Bank many Palestinians have been killed and harassed by settlers. President Biden has actually begun to proactively sanction Israeli settlers. First time that has happened. So the dynamics in the West Bank don't get a lot of airtime, but it raises the broad question of what Israel's ultimate objective is. But how do you figure in West Bank dynamics into this problem?
Yeah, well, that's been an underlying issue for a long time, and it's one of the reasons why people kept pointing out that agreements like the Abraham Accords that were negotiated under the Trump administration were ultimately not a peace plan because they didn't solve the most fundamental part of the conflict, which is, again, the long conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and that as Israel's government, moved rightward and eventually began to include as ministers, settlers, and advocates of a greater Israel, this problem was just going to get worse. And unfortunately, both the Trump administration and also the Biden administration paid almost no attention to this problem until, the last several months or so. I think what it highlights, though, is that Israel does not have a political strategy here. And when I say that is if you're committed to greater Israel, and if you're committed, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has been throughout his political career, to opposing any form of Palestinian state, then what are your options? Your only options are permanent apartheid, that you have to deny political rights to 7.5 million Palestinians, and by the way, that's roughly the same number of Israeli Jews, or you have to get rid of them in some fashion. You have to do ethnic cleansing. You have to expel them from the territories or worse. Those are your only two options if you're committed to a greater Israel. And of course, you're not willing to have a multi-ethnic democracy where everybody has political rights. And this is why the United States and most of the rest of the world have said that a two-state solution is the answer here. It has to be two viable states. It has to be two states that can thrive next door to one another. But unfortunately, we've been unable to bring that about. And as I said earlier, unfortunately, the obstacles to getting there now seem bigger than they ever have been before.
Let me ask you a big question about your book, The Israel Lobby. And I'm just wondering, is the Israeli lobby stumbling?
I think it's facing obstacles it hasn't faced before. If you go back 40, 50 years, support for Israel was bipartisan. Israel had a very positive image in American politics, sort of a plucky underdog surrounded by hostile Arabs. It was seen as something of a strategic partner in the Cold War as well. So as many people, including some officials in groups like AIPAC, used to say, we had a pretty easy product to sell. That's, I think, fundamentally different today. And the reason is the long occupation, the sense that Israel was never going to give back the territories it had conquered during the Six-Day War. It was actually trying to essentially colonize them, fill them with settlers. Its treatment of the Palestinians was increasingly harsh, repeated bombing campaigns in Gaza, etc. Suddenly, you don't have a plucky underdog. You have a powerful, wealthy, nuclear-armed Israel treating this subject population in horrific ways. And you see this most evident in generational change, that people under 40, including, I should add, a number of younger American Jews, with just a very different attitude towards Israel. That has not played itself out in the political system as yet, because, again, AIPAC and others are quite effective, well-organized, well-established, have access to lots of, PACs and other sources of money, and money drives American politics in all sorts of ways and on many, many issues. So it's not going to be a sea change overnight in American politics, but I think what we are seeing is essentially a lobbying group that can't win the arguments now on the basis of facts, logic, and morality, and therefore has to use sort of raw political power, intimidation, trying to control the discourse, trying to prevent people from speaking out on these issues, because it can't win the fight if it's just an open discourse. I think you're starting to see some cracks in the edifice.
Let me just ask you finally about President Biden. We are in the 2024 race. Think about the equation in his mind. He has spoken frequently about the trauma of October 7th and the Israeli public, and I understand that. But he has not talked about, or very infrequently, about the enormous suffering and situation of the Palestinians right now. And I'm just wondering whether or not that equation, which might have worked in 1974, really works in 2024, and whether or not we may be looking for one of the first times I can remember of foreign policy actually undermining a presidential election and mattering in a significant way. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. Nobody quite knows the answer here. I mean, in some respects, Biden is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, right? If he comes down hard on Israel, threatens to withhold aid, really pushes for a ceasefire, etc., he will alienate Israeli supporters. There'll be lots of op-eds written against him. There'll be people denouncing him on Congress. Some members of the Democratic Party will protest on this. There might be some effect on campaign contributions, etc. So he knows that there's a cost to be paid if he does that. But of course, if he doesn't do that, if he sides with Israel as he has, he's alienating young progressives who were very energetic in supporting him in 2020. He's certainly alienating Arab American populations, and they are critical in a couple of battleground states. I think the other thing that's going on here is that Biden has a very traditional view of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I don't think he has fully taken aboard how much that relationship has changed and how much Israel has changed since, say, the years that he was in the Senate. And he may not understand as well as I wish he did that a more independent stance would actually be better for the United States, better for his campaign, but in the long run, probably better for Israel as well.
Well, we will leave it there. I very much appreciate the conversation. Stephen Walt, one of America's leading political scientists, thanks so much for joining us today.
Nice talking with you as always, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? My guest, Stephen Walt, makes some important points that don't often get enough attention. First, America is strategically distracted, so its actions are often inconsistent and contradictory. Second, even if America wanted things to go a certain way, other smaller powers can still get their way. Global military power used to work during the Cold War because the competition with the Soviet Union was everywhere. But today, when it comes to the great and powerful United States just trying to get Israel to stop killing innocent civilians, the United States looks impotent. That's because Israel is focused on what it wants, and the U.S. has other priorities. And the Palestinian issue is still very low on America's totem pole. The story of Gaza, the real horror, is not just Israel's unwillingness to change the temperature and find a lasting and fair arrangement with the Palestinians for its own sake, but it also is the story of America's weakness around the world. And that's the bottom line.